In fact, I'm so excited to have on our first guest, Josh Zeman. I'll tell you more about him and his work in just a moment, but also our main guest next hour, the researcher into raptors and particularly prehistoric connections between the species that we have today and what would have existed in the age of the dinosaurs. That there are dinosaurs that are flying and walking amongst us. A Most Remarkable Creature is the name of the book, The Hidden Life and Epic Journey of the World's Smartest Birds of Prey. That starts next hour, but first, we'll go back to the Summer of Sam and this amazing Netflix documentary about the sons of Sam, intentionally plural, and the story of the man who proved it. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Well, Joshua Zeman, I don't have to tell you that you did it again. It's a great piece that you've come up with here that's running on Netflix and getting me a ton of interest on Twitter as people are saying, you got to see this. And I'm like, not only see it, we've got the director scheduled. So thank you for agreeing to be with us here on Coast to Coast.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Not a surprise you're the same guy who did Cropsey.
That's right.
That was cool. And that was a complete surprise. I mean, for me, anyway, I didn't know what to expect. I liked the graphic. I liked the photo. I clicked onto it. I thought I'd give it some time. Really enjoyed your mediation of it, your narration, and the personalization you brought to the story of Cropsey. And then that weird left turn that it takes somewhere in the middle, which in a lot of ways, it takes another left turn and brings us to Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, which is currently in the top 10 of all things being watched on Netflix.
Yeah, we've been there's been an amazing response to the series, so we're really happy about that.
But the connection had to have come when you were researching Cropsey, because it just seems like those two things dovetail too nicely to be a coincidence that you did Sons of Sam after you did Cropsey.
So Cropsey basically, as some of your viewers might know, is about some 5 missing kids in my hometown of Staten Island, New York. And while we were doing that documentary and researching, we kept hearing rumors going around Staten Island about these kids were somehow connected to a cult, and a cult that was theoretically behind the Son of Sam. And growing up in Staten Island in New York, I had known all about the Son of Sam. I had no idea that it could be connected to my case. I actually thought that all these rumors were just satanic panic. But a couple of the cops sat me down and they said, no, actually, there's a real connection here. And let me tell you a story. And they started by saying, you have to read this book, The Ultimate Evil, written by Maury Terry. And I read the book, and it scared the crap out of me. And from that, I met Maury Terry, and he proceeded to tell me about the Son of Sam and how the Son of Sam didn't act alone. And that basically started this journey, 10 years, 12 years in the making.
Yeah, it's worth every second of the research that you put into it. I'm not going to give it away, but I absolutely loved the ending. The final ending. That was such a left hook. I thought it was great. And I thought in a way, I was like, well, this is nice. He's winding it down with a little denouement. And then suddenly, boom. So I thought everything about it I like. I mean, you can't hate a documentary about 1970s New York to begin with, because it was such a crummy place in so many ways, and the fashions were awful, and the hair was terrible, and oh gosh, and it was that in itself was worth the price of a ticket, because you just kind of go back in and you're like, remember before New York got its act together again. And it was just, and it was sort of the perfect backdrop for the Son of Sam killings at the same time. And yet, even as you were telling the story of Maury Terry, this investigative journalist who was sort of self-trained investigative journalist, and his work on Son of Sam, I was reminded of so many things I had forgotten, including the number of people who had said early on, there's no way that this is just one guy.
That was a really interesting thing. You know, we had done a lot of research, and I had always heard, delving into Maury's theory that Berkowitz didn't act alone. He had told me that there were whispers in the police precinct, in the Omega Squad at the time, which was this special unit that they had set up of over 300 detectives to try and find Berkowitz. And he said that some of the detectives, there was grumblings in that squad, basically, that Berkowitz didn't act alone. And finally, after years and years and years, I had spoken to some of the guys in the intelligence department of the NYPD, and they said, yeah, we actually did believe that Berkowitz didn't act alone. Not everybody, but there were definitely a core group of some who didn't believe that Berkowitz didn't act alone. One guy just couldn't have done it. And yes, it does sound like a conspiracy theory, but, Maury was right. Now, was Maury ever on Coast to Coast?
I don't know. That's a really good question. He wasn't on with me, and I've been associated with the show for a couple of decades. I should have looked that up because he would have been a natch for Coast to Coast. Yeah. You say conspiracy theory, and I just want to pause for a second because I think what's so interesting about that is the difference between what Maury Terry, this guy who used to write for the IBM newsletter or whatever it was, and who became a journalist dedicated to becoming somebody who was going to uncover the truth behind this story. I was asked this the other day at a conference, and I say the difference is conspiracy theorists are people who never want to accept an explanation. They're only focused on the why or the what. They're only interested in the question, not the answer. And Maury Terry was totally focused on the answer. He just didn't like some of the answers that he was given, but he kept digging. He didn't just keep falling back. He really, even if it meant going to South Dakota or whatever, he was determined to try to firsthand do the legwork that was necessary to uncover whether or not it was true that David Berkowitz could have acted alone.
Well, I'm if you've seen Cropsey and some of my other work like Killer Legends, even I did a series called The Killing Season about the Long Island serial killer case.
Yes.
I like to debunk conspiracy theories. I like to try and tell people the truth of what's really going on. And this was a case that was totally different than anything else I had ever seen. I went in sitting down with Maury as a complete skeptic. I didn't believe it, to be honest with you. I liked the story. I thought it was really interesting, but I didn't believe it. And Maury was kind of so invested in making sure that everybody understood the truth that he kind of pushed people away rather than lulling them in. And maybe that was part of his downfall. So I was a skeptic, and he would go in and he would tell me these things, and I'd be like, I'm not so sure. And then he'd kind of shuffle off into his bedroom and come out with a piece of evidence, and it would blow my mind.
Right.
And that was what was really interesting. It's almost like, what if there's a conspiracy theorist out there, but what if this one time it's right? He's right. And that's what I felt like I was dealing with.
And I think it's right. I think conspiracy theories, it doesn't take much to make a conspiracy. It's just more than one, right? It's just two people coordinating. And so the question isn't so much to me whether or not there's a conspiracy involved. That's easy. The question, a guy getting his mother to cover for him to say where he was that night is a conspiracy by definition. Right. But beyond just conspiring with somebody, it was, as you mentioned, it was that satanic piece. That's the part that starts, you right away, because we've been down that road, and every time some 13-year-old, spray painted something on a garage door, everybody was looking for covens or whatever, and it was like that, wait, ho. But this is one of those cases where it really seems to be the only explanation.
That's the whole thing. I was walking in there believing it was satanic panic, and I looked at a lot of those cases, like Ricky Casso, on Long Island. Here's a kid, he kills another kid, and as he's killing him, he's stuffing rocks down his throat or something like that, and he's saying, "Say you love Satan, say you love Satan," and he kills this kid, and everybody's like, "Oh, that's a satanic crime." Not really. This was just a kid who wore an AC/DC T-shirt and did a lot of drugs and kind of like to play that game. He's what they call a dabbler. This was really an actual true case. Now, what I mean by that is, was the devil real? No. But what we're talking about is a bunch of people, maybe 3 or 4, maybe a little bit more, who were actually committing crimes, quote, in the devil's name. Now, was it just in the devil's name? No. There was some more financial motivations behind it, but they used the satanic part as a motivator. What better way to convince people to commit crimes than giving it a religious background? And that is what I believe was part of it.
Yeah, well, it is also, especially of that period, what better reason to get a bunch of people to get naked and run around the woods?
Of course.
Right?
I mean, I think a lot of it was sex too,
Yeah.
And it was, and I think that it was a great motivator to get people to commit these crimes. And, chaos, people do like chaos, like
they do.
Without a doubt. We can't deny that some people kind of are drawn to chaos and like to commit crimes in the name of chaos, but there's also other reasons behind it. Now, when Maury originally revealed to the world that he believed that there were other people involved, and he had a really good amount of evidence to do that, the police called him a crackpot. And I think what happens is Maury kind of doubled down. Maury kind of spun out a little bit because the police kept calling him crazy.
Yeah, I think that in a way that was the play, right? It was to go ad hominem. And to discredit him, then they didn't have to worry about whatever he had to say. And what he had to say was a threat to their promotion. What he had to say was a threat to their success. What he had to say was, sort of piqued a lot of the same old, the police versus the press wars that have been going on. And I think, again, to circle back a little bit, we're talking with Joshua Zeman, the executive producer and director of The Sons of Sam, A Descent into Darkness, big hit on Netflix. It's not just because it's so challenging to watch, but because I do think there's a new generation of people who are not influenced by the original police investigation, and to them, they don't care what the police had to say in 1979. Doesn't bother them, and so they're looking at it completely fresh. And I think that's the success of a true crime doc like this, is it forces a reassessment that the press doesn't do well and the police are certainly not interested in.
That's very true. A lot of Maury's kind of he had a core group of people around him, and interestingly enough, they called themselves the Pine Street Irregulars,
right?
After
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle,
yeah, and of course Pine Street, where David Berkowitz lived. And for years, they have been trying to get this narrative out there that Berkowitz didn't act alone, and the world kind of ignored them, partly because of Maury's kind of descent down the madness, down the rabbit hole a little bit towards the end of his life. And so they said to me, "Josh, what makes you think you are going to be able to change the public's mind?" And I said, "You know what? Recently, what's been going on with the police, we now have a different viewpoint of the police. We now, because of TV and because of video,
body cams.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's no longer just, good guys, bad guys, white hats, black hats. People understand that police investigations can now really be influenced by politics and things like that. And that's exactly what happened. You were saying what a crazy time it was. It was a crazy time. I mean, you had New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy. You had fires, over 12,000 cases of arson. The Bronx was burning. You had a blackout, which caused millions of dollars worth of damage. You had police unions. Police were being laid off. You had sanitation workers being laid off. You had mountains of garbage in the street. Crime was an incredible high, 4 murders, 5 murders a night. And it was just an incredible time.
Right.
And basically, suddenly on top of it, you have these murders. And, suddenly nobody's going out. They're not going to restaurants. They're not going to discos. They're not going to bars. The streets are empty, which kind of sounds familiar, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the streets are empty. And suddenly they catch this guy who says, "What took you so long?" David Berkowitz. And he's led in front of the cameras, and he's smiling. And he says, "A dog commanded me to do it."
Right.
He was the perfect patsy, and he was exactly what Mayor Abe Beame and New York City needed. He was a sacrifice to allow them to kind of get back on their feet. So, and he admits it. He admits to doing all of it. Now, what's crazy is that the police did not do a very good what's called post-arrest investigation. They didn't even interview John and Michael Carr, the two other real-life sons of Sam.
Yeah, they were.
Not do that. So it was an amazing time, and so you can understand in some respects if this guy, David Berkowitz, who's smiling for the cameras, who lives alone, and he's a postal worker, it fits. So why keep pushing forward? But, that's time. It's like Maury was always, he's like, I don't understand. I was like, Maury, come on. That's Chinatown, Jake.
Right, exactly.
This is the big city. This is how things go.
Oh, and to reference another movie, it's the New York Police Department post Serpico, and it post that whole investigation in the early 70s, where this was their first chance to look like the heroes again in a lot of ways. They were wearing, if they weren't wearing black hats, a lot of them were wearing gray hats. Anyway, all right, so this is where we'll pick it up. We're talking with Josh Zeman, the executive producer, the director of that new Netflix series about Sons of Sam, and I'm going to allow you to get into the conversation next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. A diminutive mayor of New York, Mayor Abe Beame, who might as well have been the mayor of Munchkinland, a police department that was very proud of the fact that they had tripped fairly by accident into a conclusion for the Son of Sam killings. And then what was left over? Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Joshua Zeman is the executive producer and the director, the writer of terrific docs. Go through the list. And I forgot about Killing Season, by the way. I want to tell you what I think you do right. Just like a footnote. You do something really well that not everybody does, and I think it separates you out from a lot of the crime porn that pretends to be true crime docs, is that you remain victim-centric.
It's important. I think there is a lot of true crime porn out there, and, we can't lose sight of really what this is about, and it's either finding justice or also giving those victims a voice. That's one of the things in the Sons of Sam case. There's a victim, Carl De Niro, who was shot, was a victim of the Son of Sam. For years he tried to find out who really shot him. Berkowitz said that he wasn't the one that pulled the trigger. He went to the police. The police even kind of dismissed him. And so, it was important for for this series to get made. It's so funny because you say that every time I talk to him, and every time that Carl does one of these look back historical reviews of the Son of Sam, he goes, "Oh, they say the same old thing, the barking dog scenario." And he's like, when are people actually going to listen and actually going to get the story right? And so that was something that we really tried to do.
But it was also the Stacy Moskowitz piece of that and other things. And I tell that to you you actually even echoed what Anne Rule, the queen of true crime, told me when I interviewed her when I was working on my dissertation. And she said, real true crime must always be victim-centric. Everything else is just crime porn. And I thought that was such an interesting way of looking at it. And she said, I provide the voice for the dead. And the voice for the dead is always crying out for justice and also to be heard. Women, in her case, that she felt had been silenced, and she was there to teach the living the lessons from the dead in true crime. And I thought, God, that's just brilliant. So love how you do that, and you do that. You've done that in everything I've ever seen you do, and I think that's what should give any victim's family confidence in talking to you.
Thank you.
I hope that's your experience. Yeah. So
one interesting anecdote to that story is when I did Cropsey, one of the parents said, "Okay, I'll speak to you, but please promise me that you're never going to do one of those serial killer docs." And I said, "Okay, I promise I never will." And then when we did the Killing Season, which was about the Long Island serial killer, I had to kind of go back and say, "Look, I want to do this series because these women, don't have a voice. The sex workers
right.
who didn't have justice." And she said, "Okay, fine. You can do it now."
That's an interesting overlap to last night's conversation about Jack the Ripper too. And I just want to. I think that's where, again, when you're talking about giving victims a voice, you aren't doing a serial killer doc. You're doing a serial killer victims doc. And that's what should make. I mean, that's definitely how my wife bought in. She's kind of repulsed by things like that, but she was completely transfixed. That and the horrible fashion and hair decisions made by female reporters in the 1970s.
I think they're great. Honestly, that's part of the.
Come on. They look like either about to go to an aerobics class or they're just about to do a cameo on the Jetsons. I mean, it was like, what? There was no the men are just wearing boring suits and ties, but the women, whatever, the headbands, stuff is crazy.
Or in Brooklyn, no shirts at all.
Right. That's right. So, all right. So again, Josh Zeman, the new doc, Sons of Sam. What you set out to do was to pick up the fallen mantle of Maury Terry. This reporter, the self-proclaimed investigative reporter who proved himself, but then also became over-identified with his ideas. He lost that sliver of objectivity between his ideas and himself, and therefore anybody that talked about his ideas, he felt, were really just talking about him, and that's how he ended up becoming so defensive before he was dead, and he lost friends and allies along the way.
Very much so. I think he fell down the rabbit hole of his own case, which is something that I think we all can understand, especially with the internet. We can all fall down that rabbit hole so easily. Part of the goal was to make a cautionary tale of true crime, especially considering what's going on today with all this proliferation of true crime. I mean, you have to understand that it's a dangerous world, and there are consequences, and it's easy to get myopic. And I think part of the importance of true crime is listening to all sides as well.
Yeah. But I mean, I think in that way, true crime functions as our modern folk tales, and that it functions as what we used to have a lot of was morality plays. Yeah. And it explained normative behavior. And when that true crime seems whack is when they focus on, and then this killer did this, and then he did that, and it's like, eh. So the idea, though, that this was a satanic cult, I mean, you have video, you have testimony, you have follow-up research, and you have a way of presenting the story in the sober fashion, which really does make the case for an international, at least national, but if not international, and I think you make the case pretty effectively about the connection to England, giant underground dark family that may have even included Charles Manson. And even that seems crazy at first blush.
The Manson connections are interesting, but where I think Maury went wrong is somehow thinking that these were all connected, truly organized, because I think bad people manage to find each other in the darkness. stumbling through. Bad people gravitate. People who like to do kind of evil things gravitate towards each other. But I think Maury realized in the end that it wasn't an organized network. It wasn't connected. What it was is basically like any organization, like any religion. Typically, if you were to ask me the leaders of the process, they're fine. They had no idea. They were spiritualists. They had some crazy ideas born out of 1970s, but I don't think there was anything nefarious going on in the upper echelons of the process at all. What I think was, once the process broke up in New York City, there were one or two individuals who were trepidating on the dark side, who then kind of went further. And that is where I think we broke from Maury's initial conclusions. Towards the end of his life, Maury started to realize, you know what, it wasn't some network. It was really, a bunch of people who like to do bad things and kind of using the idea of Satanism as a moral cover or immoral cover, for example, for things that they like to do. But it wasn't, this hobble of international satanic pedophiles. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
We're talking about a bunch of guys in Yonkers. And yes, does a guy from Yonkers happen to go to California at the same time and maybe come back? Sure, one of them, two of them. But I really am hard-pressed to say whether it's some kind of organized network, and especially in the way in which people talk about organized networks today. No, that's not what was happening. You know what? It was more the mob than it was organized networks of Satanists.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I also, the only thing I would parse out of that is, by the end of it, the idea of a Manson connection doesn't seem so crazy. I mean, it's like Terry made big claims, and then especially with the ending in mind, you go, okay, wait a second. He had that prediction right. What else could he have gotten right if he had lived long enough to investigate it?
Well, the thing is, the process, which is theoretically one of the organizations which we talk about, and, the process disbanded from England. They went over to California, many other places too, but including California. And, they went to Haight-Ashbury. Manson was hanging out in Haight-Ashbury. Manson probably went to one of their meetings. They had a soup kitchen. He was interested in religious ideas. He went in there, heard something, and of course what happens? Manson leaves and goes to start his own cult, and kind of in the wrong hands, that's going to be very bad. His organization, which we know was called The Family, ironically, Berkowitz and his organization was called The Children, So I also think that people who like to start, for lack of a better word, in this case, cults, kind of have the same playbook.
And I think that playbook, the interesting connection for so much of that, oddly enough, again, comes back to the upper Midwest, in a place which you never would have suspected, but where the other people who are linked to the murders also frequented. Now, how weird is that? And so totally I don't want to give that any more of that away, because it was such a wonderful twist. And besides that, Dorothy wants to talk to you west of the Rockies on Coast to Coast AM. She lives on Murder Mountain. Dorothy, I don't know where Murder Mountain is. Explain that.
I do.
Didn't you do the documentary Murder Mountain?
I did. I also did Murder Mountain. And I have to say, I love Humboldt. I think Humboldt is an amazing place. I think Island Mountain, Alder Point, it's a great place.
You did the Murder Mountain documentary.
I did, that's correct.
But I was unfamiliar with it. So Dorothy or Josh, fill me in on that.
I did a 6-part series that was also on Netflix about 2 years ago called Murder Mountain, which looked at the transition of the black market into the white market and used a kind of crime to explain the difficulties of transitioning, and that was the murder of Guerra Rodriguez and a number of individuals who lived up in that community who helped kind of try to bring that killer to justice.
Dorothy, you had a follow-up question for Josh?
Yeah, I was wondering, for the people who were victims or families of victims of the Son of Sam,
Mm-hmm.
this has got to be really difficult for them to think that there are other people, sons of Sam, still out there walking around that may have killed their loved one and, have no repercussions. That's got to be really disconcerting for them.
And Maury Terry, as we were talking before about victims, he was very much into making sure that he pled his case about and brought his evidence to many of the victims, that being the Moskowitz family, and, of course, Carl Denaro, who was one of the victims. And by the end of it, some of his biggest supporters were the victims' families. They realized after speaking to a number of police officers, and we're talking decorated NYPD, who said, you know what, I looked into this case as well. I found some incredible inconsistencies. I brought those to my superiors. They told me to shut the investigation down. So the families, or at least Carl and some of the others, some of them are actually very happy that finally this case is getting looked at with this eye. The question is, what's really going to happen? Is the NYPD going to reopen up the case? And that's not up to the NYPD. That's up to a district attorney. But there are people who are finally feeling that they're being heard, and that's important.
One of those, whenever you put out a doc like this, I'm sure you get lots of interesting feedback and people who say, I just watched this and it jogged a memory, or I found, as I sometimes describe it as, the shoe boxes full of evidence in Dad's closet kind of a thing. And it's in those shoe boxes of history sometimes that things are revealed. And I couldn't help, I'm sort of haunted by one thing. And that was the proposition that the murder of Stacy Moskowitz was filmed or videotaped, and that it was set up to be that in order to, satisfy the bloodlust of the one of those small groups of people that thought of themselves as Satan worshipers that were meeting out in the woods. Have you heard from anybody that can back up that story that the murder of Stacy Moskowitz was not done by David Berkowitz, but it would have been orchestrated by people who wanted to film a murder?
Yes, I heard from a member of law enforcement who said that they had in fact corroborated the existence of that tape. Now, also, anytime you're dealing with a criminal case and somebody says snuff film, you should immediately be skeptical. It's one of those unicorns like you were talking about.
Yeah.
And that should, people like to throw around this term snuff film. And again, be skeptical anytime you hear it, because chances are it'll fall into this kind of BS satanic category.
Right.
Again, and this is what makes this case so interesting. As a skeptic, and I look at it, this is one case where this idea of a snuff film may actually be true. And if you speak to FBI agents like Kenneth Lanning, who is an unbelievable expert in this and helped to dispel the whole satanic panic myth, he says that such snuff films aren't real. But I've tried to convince him in this case that there is that. Now, is it a very good film? Meaning, was that really what was going on? Probably not. But yes, attempts were made to film it.
Okay. There was a template once given to me by the original executive producer of the show, who once said to me, the best coast-to-coast shows start with everybody going, no way. And then by the end of it, before you go to bed, just before you turn off the light, when the show's over, you go, well, maybe. And I think that that's exactly the pattern that I experienced while watching I was reminded of how much guff Maury Terry had experienced and how many times I had seen him on shows, and how I might, too, have been one of those viewers that after a while dismissed him. I'm glad you've resurrected the work. You resurrect him and keep him immortal in the meantime. Josh, I hope this is not the last time you will come and share some air with us. But I just want you to know I'm a big fan, and you'll always find a soft landing here on Coast to Coast, no matter what you're doing, okay?
Stand by for a wild ride tonight on the Paranet Continuum. We're going to sail right into the middle of the night, if you will, with a guest, very interesting guest. And some of you people out there who are above the age of 40 will probably recall some of these events. But, let's kind of recap. In towns throughout America, they came face-to-face with the ultimate evil. August 1969, Sharon Tate and 6 others are massacred northwest of Los Angeles by followers of Charles Manson. October 1974, Arliss Perry is the victim of a perverse ritual murder in a chapel on the Stanford University campus in California. February 1977, Fred Cowan murders 6 people before killing himself during a day-long siege at the Neptune Moving Company in New Rochelle, New York. July 1976 through August of 77, New York City is terrorized as the Son of Sam murders leave 6 dead and 7 wounded. February 1978, John Carr is found shot under questionable circumstances in Minot, North Dakota. October 1978, John's brother, Michael Carr, dies in a suspicious car accident in New York City. December 1981, Joseph Carrozza is shot twice with a .38 caliber revolver in New Rochelle, New York. July 1983, the long-dead corpse of missing movie producer Roy Radin turns up in a California desert. And November 1984, 16-year-old Teresa Fusco is abducted, raped, strangled, and dumped nude in a wooded area in Lynbrook, Long Island, and the evil one to kill again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Gear Magazine, which has just come out with a piece titled The Ghost of 77, was written by my guest tonight, Maury Terry, who published a book called The Ultimate Evil. Now, Maury Terry is credited by law enforcement officials as being an expert on the Son of Sam case and on cult killings. He has researched and written more than 40 articles on the topic and has served as associate producer and on-camera host for 5 nationally syndicated television specials based on his work. And Terry won the 1982 United Press International's Enterprise Award for investigative reporting. He has also acted as a consultant in the Atlanta child murders investigation that occurred back in the 80s. And, of course, The Ultimate Evil was his very first book, and it's a pleasure to welcome to the program tonight, Maury Terry. Good morning, Maury.
Good morning, Michael. Nice to be with you.
I want to thank you for being with me at this ungodly hour over there in New York.
Well, it's payback for the people in Denver who were very nice to me back in
well, great.
1987 in the Rose Bowl, January the 25th. I'm a New York Giants fan. So
well, excellent. Well, thanks again for being on the program. As I told you earlier today when I talked to you, you're to be commended for your persistence and your perseverance in this very bizarre case that, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure as far as you're concerned, has never been truly amiably resolved.
It has not been amiably resolved. What the case needs is a grand jury, and if a grand jury can be convened, I believe that the case at that point will be resolved. I think the case is basically solved. I think there's enough evidence to bring it to a grand jury, and hopefully that will happen at some point.
Okay. Now, before we get to the part about the article that appeared in Gear Magazine this month, let's go back a little bit in time here and kind of frame this for us. I started off by mentioning some of the trail of bodies, if you will, going back to 69 to Sharon Tate. Now, I know Sharon Tate was not involved directly with Berkowitz, but can you establish for us what took place and kind of give us a background on what happened?
In the Tate case?
No, actually in the Son of Sam case.
Oh, sure. Between July of 1976 and August of 1977, a series of homicides and attacks with nighttime attacks occurred throughout the boroughs of New York City. There were 8 different incidents, a total of 13 victims, 6 dead and 7 wounded. Mm-hmm. A lot of the attacks occurred in lovers' lanes. All the victims were shot with .44 caliber gun. Many were in lovers' lanes. Others were young girls walking down the street by themselves, so on and so forth. The victims were all young, white, mostly female, and it evolved into the biggest case in New York history and one of the biggest in modern American history, and became known as the Son of Sam shootings. And on August 10th of 77, a 24-year-old postal clerk by the name of David Berkowitz was arrested outside his apartment building in suburban Yonkers, just north of New York City. And Berkowitz confessed to doing all of the shootings and to doing them all by himself. And at the time when he was arrested, he claimed that a neighbor's dog, this may register with people, was really a demon and gave him the orders to kill and so on and so forth. And that's why he did it. And there was no trial. Berkowitz avoided a trial, pled guilty, was sent away. And that was supposedly the end of it, only it wasn't. I began an investigation of it almost immediately after Berkowitz was arrested, and within almost 2 years' time, I began writing articles for the Gannett newspaper chain in Westchester County, north of New York City, and then the district attorney of Queens County, in which 5 of the 8 Son of Sam incidents occurred, reopened the case, and then went public stating he believed that Berkowitz, in fact, was part of a conspiracy. And that is sort of it in a nutshell. There have been a lot of developments over the years since then. Most recently, which the Gear magazine article covers, is that in 1996, the police in Berkowitz's hometown of Yonkers reopened the case quietly, ran a quiet investigation for 2 years, to determine if Berkowitz was in fact part of a conspiracy that was concocted in their jurisdiction, and they have now determined that there is evidence indeed that he was part of such a conspiracy, and have recommended that the case go to a grand jury and the probe to be continued. Mm-hmm. That's where it stands as of this minute.
As of this minute. Now, your background as a journalist, is that correct?
Yes.
How did you start getting involved in this and realizing that something just wasn't ringing true?
Like many, many people in metropolitan New York back then, you couldn't avoid the case. It was all over the front pages. It dominated the headlines. Mm-hmm. TV news, radio news, day in and day out, and it was such a huge case. And I just became interested in it. And when Berkowitz got arrested, and a couple of comments that he allegedly made to the cops leaked out, things just didn't seem to add up. Like he would have had to have been in 2 places at once. In order to be the shooter, the police had released a series of artist drawings mm-hmm. of the so-called Son of Sam, and some of them were widely different than Berkowitz. And I started out with those kinds of troubles on my mind, and started making inquiries. And within a short time, I came up with some evidence that just convinced me to keep going, mm-hmm. and that led into other people in the case.
This is a very interesting case, I guess, because mostly I think because of the implications and the things that were involved. Now, going back to the beginning when I started off by going over the trail of bodies, if you will, what is the connection, or what was the connection between when you mentioned in your book Sharon Tate and the 6 that were massacred northwest of Los Angeles by followers of Charles Manson?
As it turns out, and this is the last thing I was looking for when I got into this case, as it turns out, Berkowitz was a member of a very sophisticated cult group that had come over from England in 1967. It was a satanic cult group, an Armageddon cult. It was known as the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Process landed in America in 1967, established chapters in a number of U.S. cities, mm-hmm. And were very active in California. And there is quite strong evidence that Charlie Manson himself had joined a Process cell in California, and in 1968. And here we go into 1977, 9 years later, and Berkowitz had also joined a Process operation in New York. So, on different coasts at different times, the evidence is very, very strong that both Manson and Berkowitz had belonged to the same organization.
Mm-hmm. And the other interesting thing, too, that I think is brought up also in your article, the recent article in Gear magazine, is the possible connection between the Process Church and Sirhan Sirhan, who has been convicted and is serving time for the assassination of Robert Kennedy.
Yes, I've seen Ed Sanders, who back in the early 70s, wrote an excellent book on the Manson murders called The Family, Vincent Bugliosi having written the other one called Helter Skelter.
Mm-hmm.
Sanders had unearthed some information strongly pointing toward the involvement of the process in the Manson case. And he had also heard things about the possibility that Sirhan Sirhan had, in fact, dabbled in process activities. I found the same thing through a series of reports that were given to me to read. They were reports from the INS, in fact, and in it was stated that Sirhan, that witnesses had told the L.A. authorities that Sirhan had attended at least one process sex ritual in the Los Angeles area. And there was another report that a process member was actually a chef or a cook or an assistant cook in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, which is, as we all know, is where Robert Kennedy was shot, right in that kitchen in that hotel.
As I recall, and I don't know if I remember this correctly, so maybe you may know and correct me if I'm wrong. Did not Robert Kennedy have dinner at the Tate House the night that he was killed?
Actually, I believe it was at the beachfront home in Malibu of Peter Lawford, who was a Kennedy brother-in-law, and that Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski were among the dinner guests.
I see, okay. Which is kind of an interesting coincidence.
I think it is a coincidence. It seems to be a coincidence.
Yeah. Maury, let's go kind of talk about the process, where it comes from, where it came from, where it had its origins, and how they got ever so entwined in our culture to be able to do what they've done.
The process, which still exists today under another name, there are a number of groups on the internet these days calling themselves the Process or Son of Process, but that's not the real process. The real process went underground, changed its name several times, and exists today under a benign name.
Mm-hmm.
But it began in 1963 as an offshoot of Scientology. The head of the process, Robert de Grimston, and his wife, Mary Ann, in London, had been mid-level officials, I'd say, or counselors in Scientology, and had a falling out with L. Ron Hubbard, and went off to start their own group, which they called Compulsion Analysis at the beginning. And they recruited among some friends of theirs, and they were looking like all called stew for the wealthy recruits.
Mm-hmm.
And they gathered a group about them of such people in London, and it started to grow, and eventually they changed their name to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, because they were preaching Armageddon at the millennium,
mm-hmm.
Hence the Final Judgment, the name of the Final Judgment. And in 1967, a group of process members came over to America, landed in America, established chapters first in New Orleans, then where they incorporated as an occult church, and that's right in their corporate papers, readily available,
Mm-hmm.
and branched out into Haight-Ashbury, then along the Sunset Strip, the perfect place, New York City's Greenwich Village, the perfect places where they could find the type of the hippie element and all the rebellious young people that they were looking to recruit. And they arrived at a perfect time. It was the era of anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. You had the free love, the Timothy Leary's turn on, tune in, drop out,
Mm-hmm.
rebellion against all authority, et cetera, and Process had fertile ground to plow in the counterculture of American youth of the late 1960s.
Particularly up there at Berkeley.
Yes, they had a chapter, and they were living right in Haight-Ashbury, and trying to recruit around Berkeley, and they had an address on Cole Street in the Haight, and they were only a block or so from where Manson was residing at the same time, and that was certainly his first exposure to them.
I find this all very fascinating because, as you mentioned, these places and these locations and the people that were, circulating around all of these things, they all feed into this in one way or the other.
Yeah. That's right. Process also was up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There,
around Harvard.
Right around Harvard. Again, they knew right where to go to get to try to recruit the kinds of people that they were looking for. Where they figuring, of course, where they would have the most success.
Mm-hmm.
And in New Orleans, they were right in the French Quarter.
In the French Quarter?
In New Orleans.
In New Orleans, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we'll get more into the into how they got entrenched in New York and how Berkowitz got involved with them, and what led to all of these bizarre, horrific murders. And again, this is a very interesting story. My guest is Maury Terry. We're talking to him about some late developments in the Son of Sam case. The Yonkers Police Department concludes a 2-year investigation that concludes that there was indeed a conspiracy, and David Berkowitz did not act alone. He was not the lone .44 caliber killer, as some people called him. This man was jailed for the Son of Sam murders that paralyzed New York, but did he really act alone? I'm referring to David Berkowitz, of course. A new police investigation may finally bring out the whole horrific truth, and we're talking with Maury Terry, who's in New York and who has been investigating this for many years, and through his persistence and perseverance is hopefully going to bring about, as he mentioned, a grand jury investigation, which may, of course, blow the lid off of this whole thing once and for all and bring it to an amiable close. Welcome back, Maury.
Welcome back. Nice to be here again, Michael.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about, the reason I want to kind of talk about this, too, because I think it has some relevance to today and some of the activities that we see in our culture today. And as Berkowitz mentioned on the A&E piece that you interviewed him in, he was under the influence of some kind of mind control. And is that correct?
Well, to the extent that that he was like many young people, not that they turn into killers,
mm-hmm.
but there were many young people out there wandering around looking to belong to something. And it's a very old cliche. You've heard it many times, but when somebody's hungry, they'll take the bread from who's ever there to give it to them.
Mm-hmm.
And Berkowitz was drifting about, and he was vulnerable to the rap that was laid on him, all about how great the occult was, and it was a special thing to be a part of, and he was vulnerable enough to accept all of this. And as he did put it to me, once you get sucked into it, before too long, the tide's carrying you out to sea, and there's no way back to the shore, no matter how hard you may try to get back there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened to him. There were a few factors in his life that made him susceptible to this, and they were able to get him to go out and believe in the religiosity part of this.
Right.
I mean, some of these people were in it for their own reasons, but Berkowitz and a number of others really believed in the religious side of this thing,
mm-hmm.
and they thought they were on some sort of divine mission when they were out there doing these things.
It's incredible.
And this was all part of the process rap. The process people, if one knows their background, they are not the low-level people of society at all. When they came over from England, we're talking about university-educated people who led the process. You had architects, accountants, a couple of people with stage backgrounds, and so on and so forth. Very, very intelligent people. And the problem is that they were also very bent and perverted themselves and lusted after power. And their idea was to recruit the David Berkowitzes of this world to go out and do their dirty work. At the same time, this devil stuff was really on the surface. They used it as a tool. But they were also operating a criminal enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
They were into providing young kids to the wealthy for sex parties and so on and so forth. And they had their connections and their hooks and their tie-ins and their ability to blackmail down the road some pretty kinky wealthy people. And they had friends in high places, in other words, and they provided a service to those friends. And so when they needed favors, they were able to get them. And as time has gone by over the years, as I've become to learn a lot more about how this Son of Sam / process operation worked, it's become very, very clear why they were able to get away with this in New York, and why when David Berkowitz got arrested and said, "Oh, a dog barked and I did it," and the lid went on the case, it's very, very obvious why that was allowed to happen, why there was no investigation to follow up on it, because Berkowitz's confession had more holes in it than you would find in a barrel of Swiss cheese, but they didn't care.
And we're going to get to that probably before we get done with you tonight. We're going to get to those reasons, because as you mentioned, they had their hooks into some very high level people.
They did indeed, and this, of course, I didn't know until the last couple of years how high up it went.
You know, that's very, very interesting, and I'll tell you, if I may quote the last two paragraphs of your article, I think that's the most chilling thing I've read in a long time. It says, the process, meanwhile, under a new name and a socially acceptable cover, as you just mentioned, is still functioning in 1998. Records show that the group has acquired millions of dollars in vast real estate holdings along the way in its quest to inspire Armageddon in time for its professed witching hour, the millennium. In other words, the process, to borrow a haunting phrase from a Son of Sam letter, is, quote, still here, like a spirit roaming the night. And that's chilling. You mentioned earlier that it's under a different name, a benign name. Is it a name that we would recognize?
It's a name that some people might recognize. I wish I could reveal it, but for obvious reasons, I can't.
But you say it's benign. It's something that nobody would ever suspect. Hello? What happened there? I don't know. Okay. We still on the air? Yes, we are. Okay, we're going to get him back. We're going to find out what happened to the connection. That was very, very odd, to say the least. While Brian is getting him back on. By the way, our number is 303-860-1280, 303-860-1280. And one of the things here we got here that he's got in the article is it mentions, numerous names of people that have died as a result of this whole thing, and it's very, 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 very odd. Let's see if we're gonna get him back in here, and I think we do have him. Again, our number is 303-860-1280, 303-860-1280, and we do indeed have him back. Let's try it back again. Maury, are you there?
Yes, Michael.
What happened? Do we know?
I have no idea. From where I was sitting, the line just went dead.
Yeah, just clicked off.
Just clicked off.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, let's go to, let's discuss the part about, I guess, where you entered into it with the first chapter of your book, The Ultimate Evil, was Satan at Stanford. There was a murder at Stanford of a young woman that was seemingly unconnected to all the goings-on in New York.
Yeah, her name was Arliss Perry. She was a native of Bismarck, North Dakota, young Christian bride, been a cheerleader and a member of various Christian organizations in Bismarck, married her hometown sweetheart named Bruce Perry. Ironic story about Bruce, too. And they then relocated to Palo Alto, where Bruce was studying at Stanford University to be a doctor. And they were only on the campus about 6 weeks when Arliss was found murdered in the Stanford Memorial Church. She was killed after midnight. Actually, it was this is almost the anniversary. It was the night of October 12th, 13th, 1974. And for about 5 years thereafter, the case was unsolved. I mean, technically, it's still unsolved. And the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office thought they were searching for a local sexual psychopath, and then David Berkowitz, in 1979 from prison, dropped a note in which he mentioned some specifics about the Arliss Perry case, including polygraph keys, information that only the police would know. And when I got a hold of this letter, I had never heard of Arliss Perry, never heard of the case at all. And we soon found out what it was all about, and it turned out that the information Berkowitz had was absolutely correct and on the money. And I now know how Berkowitz came to know about that. He was at a cult meeting in New York in 1977. at a house in the Bronx, I believe, on City Island. One of the people who had been involved in Arliss Perry's killing was imported to New York to take part in the Son of Sam killings and stood up at this cult meeting in this house and started bragging about the killing and had Arliss's picture and described what had happened to her. And Berkowitz, who has a remarkable memory, remembered that, and that's how he got the information that he later put into that letter.
Now, did anybody determine, I don't recall from reading the book, did anybody determine why Arliss Perry was selected?
Arliss Perry, Berkowitz didn't know the motive, but he knew there was a motive, that they went after her for a reason.
It wasn't just a random
No,
kind of thing.
it was not. Arliss Perry had done something in her hometown of Bismarck to anger some people who were involved in a chapter of the cult group in North Dakota. And when she left to go to Stanford University, or to accompany her groom to Stanford University, they just didn't drop it. They tailed her to California, located where she was living in an apartment on the campus, and stalked her for a couple of weeks and set out to get her.
Now, you mentioned earlier, her husband had nothing to do with this, correct?
No, I mean, obviously her husband was the first suspect. The way this happened was they had an argument the night of the murder in the apartment, and she went out to take a walk and went to the church where she often went since she was a religious person. But of course, Bruce was the first suspect when they finally found the body. But very ironic about Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry went on to become a psychiatrist.
Really?
And in the Waco case a few years ago, Bruce Perry is now connected to Baylor University. And Bruce Perry was one of the doctors who was counseling the young kids who had been released from the Waco compound by Koresh before the federal government assaulted and killed all those people.
Wow.
And Bruce Perry is, I don't know whether he's in a state of denial or what, but from what I understand, he appears at conferences just downplaying occult crime in general in the United States. And I just want to, when this information gets back to me, it surprises me, and I just write it off to, still a strong sense of denial about what really happened to his bride.
Wow. Hold that thought, Maury. We'll go to take another break. When we come back, we'll delve more into this interesting case. Maury Terry is my guest. We're talking about The Ultimate Evil, the book that he wrote back in the early 80s, I believe it was, and of course his recent article in Gear magazine concerning late developments in the Son of Sam case. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. My guest is Maury Terry. We're talking about David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, and we are finding out, as Maury Terry has been maintained for many years, that David Berkowitz did not act alone. We're going to find out tonight why David Berkowitz why Maury Terry says that David Berkowitz did not act alone. It's because there's some very interesting developments over the years, as you've heard Maury mention. And Maury, we've got about probably about 3-4 minutes before the network news. Let's talk about how your investigation went beyond Arliss Perry. What took you to North Dakota? Because that's a bizarre story as well.
Well, the North Dakota connection at first was because of one of the people who Berkowitz has now named as a co-conspirator and actually as one of the shooters in the case. His name was John Carr. He was the son of Berkowitz's neighbor, Sam Carr, hence the term Son of Sam. Literally, John Carr and his brother Michael were the sons of Sam. And John Carr surfaced as an immediate suspect of mine in the case right after Berkowitz was arrested because of an alias used in the Son of Sam letter that happened to be John Carr's nickname. And if, as the police maintained at the time, Berkowitz didn't know the Carrs at all, well, how would he know the nickname of a guy who spends all his time in North Dakota? But
Correct.
He did. And so I went looking for John Carr, and 6 months after Berkowitz was arrested, I found John Carr because he was shot dead in Minot, North Dakota, in his girlfriend's apartment on Minot Air Force Base. They first called it a probable homicide, then changed it to an apparent suicide, and then it went back to a most likely homicide, and I can tell you it's been proven that it was a homicide. So somebody went out to shut John Carr up within months of Berkowitz's arrest, and Berkowitz has since told me that John Carr was the weakest link because he had a bad drug and alcohol problem, and if anybody was the likely one to crack, it would have been John Carr. Of course, Berkowitz was in jail at the time, but he said that's why they would have gone after John, because he was the weakest.
Now, where did Berkowitz get the idea to use the dog? Was that that was concocted by him and a few of his accomplices near the very, very end of the case, shortly before he got arrested, and that was just to lay the foundation for an insanity defense, which Berkowitz later, before he pled guilty in court, abandoned that and admitted it was nonsense. But that's the thing, first impressions count, and that's the thing that thing with the dog has stuck in the minds of many people for many years. It's the most ludicrous story, absolutely,
that you could imagine, and why the authorities accepted it is beyond belief, and it just leads into other areas. But interesting thing about the dog, if there's a minute, the name of the dog was Harvey was the dog's name, the talking dog, right? Well, interestingly enough, and this shows you how devious some of these people are, they got, in that movie, James Stewart talked to the rabbit. Talking rabbit, the invisible rabbit that only James Stewart could see. The rabbit's name was Harvey.
Oh, no.
That's where the idea came from.
So they just grabbed this stuff out of the air. Now,
absolutely. That's exactly what they did.
Wow. And
the biggest, and the so-called New York's finest and all was suckered into this like they were, the Hardy Boys at the age of 2 or 3 and had no knowledge about anything. It's just pathetic.
That's wild. And welcome back. 62 degrees in Denver, 106 in the morning, and of course in New York, where my guest Maury Terry is, it's much later. And I want to thank you, Maury, for being with us.
That's okay. My pleasure, my friend.
This ungodly hour.
For some.
Yeah. Okay, let's kind of pick up where we left off. We're talking again with Maury Terry, who wrote a book. When was the book published, Maury?
Hardcover, summer of '87, updated for paperback in the fall of '89.
'89, and the book was called The Ultimate Evil, and it is, in my opinion, it's the concise history of a very bizarre string of murders in the New York area that stretch out, as you've been hearing, all the way to the West Coast. And we're talking with Maury Terry about recent developments in the case, and an article that he has published in Gear magazine, which is available in all, I picked mine up here in Denver, and it's available in all major stores and magazine shops. And Maury, let's go back to New York. Let's get back to New York after.
I'm already here, Mike.
Okay.
You go back to New York.
Okay. Let's go to talk about how this case unfolds, and Berkowitz is ultimately arrested. Now, originally, people thought that he had basically, took commands from a dog that was demon possessed. And you have discovered, or a lot of people have discovered, the police even knew this at the time, that the whole arrest was arranged, wasn't it?
The police didn't know at the time that the arrest was really a setup. But yes, we've come to know that it was a setup. Another example of some of the vileness in the manner of thinking that goes on with some of the people involved in this. I mean, Berkowitz's apartment, which was set up to look like the lair of a madman, was indeed set up several days before his arrest. His apartment was a very normal apartment in a nice building overlooking the Hudson River about 17 miles north of Midtown Manhattan. And in the dead of night, Berkowitz, assisted by 3 other people, cleared out, rented a U-Haul van, cleared out his furniture, and deposited it in front of a Salvation Army warehouse in a community about 6 miles away. Left it right in front of the building. And then on the very day of his arrest, 2 other people, one of whom is named in this article for the first time, his name was John DeFrenza, and along with another guy named Richie, came over and took out some last-minute stuff, Berkowitz's mail and so on and so forth, some last-minute items And that was literally hours before the police arrived to arrest Berkowitz. Berkowitz knew the cops were on the horizon. He knew they were coming imminently, and he knew it because the night before the arrest, the cops in New York City were checking a parking ticket that had been put on his car at the last Son of Sam crime scene out in Brooklyn, and it was a routine call to the Yonkers Police Department. They thought Berkowitz might have been a witness to it. They had no idea that Berkowitz was involved in anything because they were looking for a yellow VW as the killer's getaway car, and Berkowitz was driving a full-size Ford Galaxy, which had been ticketed a couple of blocks from the crime scene for parking too close to a hydrant. So they're just doing a routine check of potential witnesses. And they actually, the New York City cops actually tried to call Berkowitz at home, which I find amusing. If he was home and answered, what would he have told them, you know? They did. And they got lazy. He didn't answer the phone, so they decided to let the Yonkers cops do their work for them. So they called Yonkers and to say, why don't we have somebody call Berkowitz or knock on his door and ask him to give us a call. Well, lo and behold, who answers the phone at Yonkers Police Department? But the daughter of Sam Carr, the sister of John Carr and Michael Carr. She has the unusual name of Wheat Carr. She was a civilian dispatcher for the Yonkers PD. So here was New York calling up saying, yeah, would you send somebody up to ask Berkowitz to give us a call? And she goes right into her act. Berkowitz, oh, him, we think he shot our dog. He's this, he's that. We think he's the Son of Sam. So suddenly, potential witness Berkowitz went to the top of the list as a possible suspect. And the very next day, New York went up and arrested him. But since the call came to, coincidentally, Wheat Carr, of course, she immediately told her brothers Berkowitz was tipped off, and Richie and John, the friends, would go over and take out some last-minute stuff the next morning, and there's Berkowitz when the cops come out and arrest him outside his building that night. And, many people wondered why Berkowitz had this enigmatic grin on his face when he was escorted into police headquarters in front of all of the cameras.
Right.
Now I know why he did. Now I know why he did.
Was she involved? Was she involved in this whole deal? Maybe.
I'd say that it's fair to say that she is under intense scrutiny.
Okay. All right. We'll take that up after the break, and we'll kind of come up to the present day and the thing that has led to Maury's article in Gear Magazine. Remember, my guest is Maury Terry, and we're talking about the infamous Son of Sam case, and something that occurred back in the late 70s, middle 70s, late 70s in New York. And it's an incredible story. And, of course, Maury Terry has been on it and developing quite a bit of material over the years. And, Maury, let's talk about the stuff that's developed since Berkowitz was convicted and has been in prison. You've developed quite a bit of wild information that kind of leads, like you mentioned earlier, to very high places.
Yeah, I mean, when I did The Ultimate Evil, information alluding to the upper levels of society, there was information in the book about that in the late 80s, but it wasn't specific information because I didn't have specific information. I was dealing through a handful of prison informants who had gotten close to Berkowitz, and he told them certain things. And but since I've been able to sit down with Berkowitz, which started in 1993, a lot of other very specific information has been developed as to who these people were. Other informants have come forward. There's a guy who is involved with the process, who's in prison in the South today. He's mentioned in that article. His name is Jesse Turner. Jesse Turner provided very, very specific information about the process and their hooks into the upper levels of society, both in New York and what they were doing in New Orleans, which is where Turner spent almost 2 years with them, and he later hooked up with them again in New York. So between the various sources of information over the last few years, very specific evidence has been developed pointing to exactly how this whole setup worked and how they were able to get away with it and what types of people were involved on the upper levels. And there were 2 aides to New York City's mayor at the time, Abraham Beame.
Mm-hmm.
There was a then Yonkers judge. There were a couple of Westchester County, which is where Yonkers is, the county just north of New York City, politicians, and there were a couple of New York State level politicians involved with this group. And by that, I want to emphasize, I don't mean that they were sitting down planning the murders with them, but they were in the social circles with this group. They were at sex parties together. The people I'm alluding to had a thing for young kids, and young kids were provided at these parties.
God.
And when Berkowitz got arrested, you can see why people like this would be scurrying around and using their old boy network behind the scenes to make sure the case wasn't pursued further, because it would lead right into their twisted lives. I was shocked at how high up it went. I'm not shocked that top-level officials some of them are into young kids. That doesn't shock me. But it just shocked me that it was so in this case, and how wide the net was spread in order to keep the lid, I'm mixing metaphors, on the case.
Right. The thing that appalls me, and I don't know if you know Senator John DeCamp, but
I'm certainly familiar with the case. I read a book that came out about that.
It was called
so on and so forth.
It was called The Franklin Cover.
Yes, out of Nebraska, right?
That's right. I interviewed the gentleman a couple of months ago on my program, and it just was. Number one, it was sickening. I mean, to me, you say you're not surprised, but of course, after the investigation that you've been involved in, I understand. But it just blew me away to hear of the kind of stuff that was going on. But the thing I wonder is, how does this kind of thing happen, and how do people at these levels get involved in something as heinous and horrific as this?
There's the Paul Revere and the Raiders song from 1966, which I always thought says so much, and the name of the song was Kicks, and it was Kicks Just Keep Getting Harder to Find. And I think some of these people, when they have the money, when they have the power, they've done everything, and they keep looking for the next thrill. What'll turn me on next? And some of them, it eventually leads into sex with kids and snuff films and so on and so forth.
Good heavens.
Because they have done everything else. I mean, there was a snuff film, and I put Berkowitz on TV, confirming this, made of the last Son of Sam shooting.
Right, I remember seeing that on the art.
They made a damn movie of it.
And they were selling it.
It's a real collector's item. It's one of those things like you hear about valuable pieces of artwork being stolen. I mean, they don't exactly advertise in magazines saying, buy this, but there are collectors who will pay a fortune just to have a valuable stolen piece of art,
Yeah.
And it was this way, as I understand it, with the Son of Sam snuff film, that there were a handful of copies made, and that they went for an awful lot of money.
One of the names that came up in the A&E piece that you're referring to was Robert Mapplethorpe.
Yeah, Robert Mapplethorpe, again, a friend of this individual named Jesse Turner, who's presently in jail for bank robbery, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. Turner and Mapplethorpe had known each other very well. Turner actually lived with Mapplethorpe when Mapplethorpe, in the early 70s, was dating and living with Patti Smith, the well-known rock singer. Well, Turner was living with them in another bedroom in the apartment. Mapplethorpe was mostly gay, but whatever he did with Patti Smith, I don't know. But that's why, and Mapplethorpe was involved with the process. And Mapplethorpe, as if people are familiar with him may know, was one of the real kings of kink. I mean, his photography and his artwork, was homoerotic to the nth degree, and scandalous to the minds of many, many people. And there was a big furor, I believe, in the late 80s, when the National Endowment for the Arts funded a display of his work, or an exhibit of his work in Cincinnati, and there was all sorts of repercussions because it was called just outrageous stuff. But Turner had been involved with process, and so was Mapplethorpe. And when they wanted this Son of Sam movie back, the word was passed through Mapplethorpe. Can you find somebody who will go get this film back from the guy who's got a copy of it? And Turner said to Mapplethorpe, sure. And he recruited two guys who went into this brownstone in Manhattan on Halloween of '81 and got the film and killed the guy. Ronald Sisman, his name was, along with a young college co-ed who was in Sisman's brownstone at the time, and took off with the film. And according to Turner, that film and four others were then sent to Mapplethorpe's post office box in Lower New York City by the gunman who did it. Now, 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, the New York City cops hauled in these two alleged gunmen who were named by Turner. One of them blew the needle off the poly machine. He was lying so badly, and the other was caught 4 times trying to beat the machine. The two of them then hired lawyers, and that case right now is at a stalemate. There were detectives in the NYPD who wanted to keep going with this, but when the top of the department learned that this was leading right into the Son of Sam case, they put the lid on it.
Wow. Now, and of course, this is was this referred to in the video piece? That was this referring to the part where the NYPD had opened the investigation? And then
that's exactly what it was. And Ronald Sisman, who was murdered there in his brownstone in '81, along with the co-ed, Sisman was actually the guy in the van at the last Son of Sam scene who was running the camera. They had a van parked across the street. There were 3 people in it. I know the identities of all 3. Sisman was one of them. And Sisman, they whacked to get the film back, in his copy of the film back in '81. One of the other people in the van was a very close associate of somebody you mentioned earlier in this program, was named Roy Radin, who was another kinky guy with a ton of money from Southampton, Long Island, who was trying to enter the movie business as a producer and was murdered over the film The Cotton Club in Los Angeles, outside L.A., in 1983. And the third person in the van was, well, okay, I'll leave the third person out of it.
Okay. Okay. The thing is that with your investigation has taken you, as you mentioned, Roy Radin, for example.
I'll tell you something about Roy Radin. The person who, one of the people involved in Radin's murder was also a shooter in the Son of Sam case.
Now, is that the guy that's now in prison that was dubbed Manson too?
That's correct.
I don't recall his name now.
Well, I haven't released the whole thing publicly, but I will before too long, I think.
Okay. I know Sanders mentioned some of this stuff in his book when he was talking about the family of Manson and all that. Let me ask you this. I know that Manson was involved in producing films of that nature. And I'm just wondering, the one question that comes up into my mind that I've wanted to ask a person like yourself who's really been deeply involved in the investigation of this stuff. Sanders alluded to the idea that there might have been some kind of intelligence community involvement in some of this activity. Have you run across anything like that in your...
Sanders mentioned that to me, too. And let me respond to it this way. I think it was a fair thing for Ed Sanders to wonder about. I have wondered about it, too. I'm not saying it's so.
Right.
The reason I have wondered about it is because I cannot understand how an organization like The Process was allowed to enter this country and still exists in this country. I mean, Vince Bugliosi pointed the finger at them in Helter Skelter. Sanders did it in The Family. I did it in The Ultimate Evil and on television and elsewhere. And that the fact that these people have not been arrested and or deported is beyond belief. It almost makes me... I mean, I know the FBI is very capable of falling asleep at the wheel. I've seen it enough. And INS sometimes is a joke. It's a big bureaucracy. But it's not as if people haven't been pointing fingers at Process. They have. Why are they still in existence? Why are they operating in America stronger today than ever? I mean, they have amassed a fortune in a lot of it is now in real estate and so on and so forth. And I could say this, the original core, with one or two exceptions, of Process leaders who came to America in 1967 are still together today.
Wow.
All together and they're a lot closer to where you're sitting than where I'm sitting.
Oh, God. God, that's not good to hear.
No, it's an absolute fact. It's an absolute fact.
Oh, boy. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll pursue even more of this. And very, very interesting. Maury, I want to thank you again, for being on the program. This is very fascinating stuff.
It's good talking with you.
We're going into the night with Maury Terry, and we're talking about David Berkowitz, son of Sam, a very, very bizarre murder case. And, of course, as you've been hearing, David Berkowitz did not act alone. There was a conspiracy. And then, as we're being told by Maury Terry, it involves very high-level people. And
yeah, that I'd like to say, Michael. Just before the break, we were theorizing or speculating a bit on the possibility of some intelligence community connection somewhere into this process organization. That's speculation. What isn't speculation is that there, in fact, was a big conspiracy in the Son of Sam case that reached into high places.
Mm-hmm.
That's been corroborated. There are witnesses. There are supporting data. That's beyond theory. That's
fact.
Is absolute fact. Berkowitz has made statements, and they have been corroborated left and right, from crime scene evidence through events in his life, through people in his life, through the activities of other. When we talked before about how his apartment was, they took the furniture out of his apartment. All that's been corroborated. Everything. I wouldn't come on your air blowing smoke about things unless I knew them to be so. And if it is a theory, I'll label it as a theory.
Yeah. What was the victims that fell that were to this thing? Were they random? How many of them were random, or were they not random?
Well, that's another thing, and I'm glad you brought that point up, because to my mind, and this has not gotten enough publicity, this is one of the critical factors of the case. I mean, at the time, it was believed that all the Son of Sam killings were done by a random psychopath. Well, psychos don't have legitimate motives for doing what they're doing.
Right.
Supposedly crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is extremely strong evidence, and Berkowitz has confirmed that it's so, that at least 2 of the Son of Sam victims, 2 out of the 8 attacks, were not random at all, but were hits, what were target hits,
mm-hmm.
that they went deliberately after the victims. By itself, that blows out the entire perception of what the public believed the Son of Sam case to be.
Right. Did these people, the 2 out of the 8, as I understand it, and I think I read this in your book, as I understand it, that the random ones, where they were done that way to basically throw people off of the trail of a deliberate hit or an assassination.
In a way, the first Son of Sam shooting was a hit against a girl in the Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
Then, they were on this campaign of terror anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole thing served a couple of purposes, and they were able to sneak a couple of hits into a string of otherwise random attacks, random as to the rest of the victims, but not random as to location. All these locations were carefully scouted for the best chance of doing something and getting away with it, and so on and so forth. But 2 of the victims were hits. The first one was a hit because she lived in an area in the Bronx, and where she came in contact with some members of this cult. She also went to a nightclub in nearby that was frequented by cult members. The point being that she heard about what they were up to and the kinds of things they were planning, and she had a big mouth, and she was killed for that reason.
Gosh.
One of the others, midway in the string, was basically a contract hit. They took a contract to eliminate somebody over some convoluted lover's triangle.
Good heavens. It's a hell of a thing to kill
somebody. And then the last
over.
one they made a movie out of, at the behest of Roy Radin.
Jeez. Now, in your article in Gear Magazine, you mentioned that the new investigation was opened in the spring of '96, which was spurred by the death of a prominent New York businessman and a handful of portraits that were sketched 20 years earlier. And of course, this was also featured in the A&E piece. Tell us a little bit about that. I know that you're not going to release the name of the businessman, but what was surrounding that? Again, there's chilling parts of this article.
We had information about one of the top leaders of this group who resided in Westchester County,
mm-hmm.
including his profession, which was real estate.
Yeah.
And generally where he lived, and so on and so on. Well, by 1995, I had the name
mm-hmm.
of who he was. And then I just happened to catch a death notice in the paper in 1996
mm-hmm.
that this person had died. The police were alerted immediately, and they had a sketch that had been provided to them by this young guy who was a budding artist back in 1976, 20 years before.
Right.
And he hung out for several weeks that summer, just before the Son of Sam murders began, in a wooded park, big wooded park, former estate in Yonkers, just near Berkowitz, where Berkowitz was living, with some of this cult group. He didn't know who they were, what they were up to, or that they were about to start on a murder campaign, and they tried to recruit him.
Is this that Untermeyer Park?
That's right. And this young budding artist would hang out with them for a while, and then he'd go home and sketch. And he sketched 4 or 5 of the people up there.
Mm-hmm.
And he sketched somebody. One of them happened, as it turned out, happened to be the leader of this group. And this kid didn't know that then, but the sketches were, in the 90s, turned over to the cops.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I noticed the obit, this guy had died, the cops went up and went in to the wake, and off the sketch, ID'd the guy. And they called me and told me, it's him. And I said, well, you guys weren't the ones who saw him in Untermeyer Park. Let me find the artist. So I found the artist, and they went and picked him up and took him up to the wake and walked him in. And he said, what am I supposed to do? They just said, just go in and see if you recognize the guy lying in the box. And he comes back out of the funeral home and said, it's him. How the hell did you know it was him? How'd you know? And, of course, they wouldn't tell him. But a remarkable story.
But he went by the name of Moloch?
That was his so-called occult name, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
And
in real life, he was in his 70s at the time of his death.
Yeah.
And he was a wealthy real estate guy who had done consulting work for the state of New York, and et cetera, et cetera.
Wow. God. What is
the reason I can't name him is because he has a couple of relatives who are also strong suspects. Otherwise, I would tell you his name right now.
Yeah. What was about the Untermeyer Park, though? I mean, there was in the A&E piece they showed the there's like a gazebo or something like that.
Yeah, Untermeyer. The Untermeyer estate goes back many years. It was originally owned by Samuel Tilden, who ran for U.S. president in 1876 against Rutherford B. Hayes.
Uh-huh.
And in 1903, it came into the hands of a wealthy lawyer named Samuel Untermeyer. And Untermeyer was very much into the occult himself. Today in the park, the remnants of his statuary and all is still there, and it very clearly shows his fascination with the occult.
Mm-hmm.
And he imported statuary and everything from England, and when Untermeyer died in 1940, the place went into disrepair and so on and so forth. And, of course, the legend about it grew, that it was sacred ground to those in the occult because they knew about Samuel Untermeyer and his affinity for it and so on and so forth.
So there was a lot of activity there.
Yes, and it was, Central Casting couldn't have put up a better place for cult rituals to occur.
Gives me the creeps, and I've never seen it.
Yeah, it's, like 25 or 30 acres or something,
uh-huh.
heavily wooded with all these old monuments and statues and everything like that. Again, just picture something Hollywood would do, and you'd say, this couldn't exist in real life, but guess what? It does.
Oh, God. What kind of a man is Berkowitz?
He's totally unlike the public perception of him at the time, although he's the first one to admit that he was out of it then. He to this minute, he can't understand how he got so crazy involved in this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He has tremendous amount of remorse. And he really doesn't think he deserves to get out of jail. A lot of these guys are saying, get me out of here, get me out of here. Berkowitz thinks he belongs there.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I did kill a couple of these people. I did do some of the shootings, not all of them, and I was involved in all of it as a conspirator. He's very open about it, so he's not trying to get out of anything.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, he's very intelligent. He has an excellent sense of humor. And if you had ever met David Berkowitz in a bar or something and started talking sports with him, you wouldn't have any idea.
Really?
Who he was or what he had been involved with. That's the kind of person he is
now. Now, in your book, you mentioned when he first went into prison, he was very reticent about talking, and there was something mentioned about his father. Why is he talking now?
Because his father, one of the reasons, there are two main reasons. One is that his father is now, 88? and he's lived a good long life, and he's been safe.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, probably a bigger reason than that, is that in the late 80s, Berkowitz became a born-again Christian. And he feels an obligation, because of his religion, to say as much as he feels safe in saying about this.
Yeah.
I mean, getting him to a courtroom is another matter. I don't know if that would ever happen. But he has felt obligated to make some statements about it, and things that he said that I put on television were extremely important and very helpful and very concise.
Is he? I guess the question, is that the threat still as potent as it was before, or is he just, because of his conviction, his conversion to being Christian, it outweighs his fear of what could happen to him if he talks?
I think there's still a battle. I know there's still a battle going on inside of him.
Uh-huh.
I mean, part of him wants to be extremely helpful, but there's the other part. He's been in prison a long time, and there's the jailhouse code. You don't want to, you're not supposed to be a snitch.
Right.
So he's torn between the two things, and I think he has come up with a compromise in his own mind. Whereas he had agreed to say enough to corroborate things and to let the investigation move forward, but there's a certain line that he doesn't want to cross.
Right. How has this affected you? I mean, you put a lot of years into this.
I've done a lot of other things too, thankfully. I mean, from 88 to 93, I basically had nothing to do with the investigation. It had ceased. I was doing other things, other cases, moving on and doing a lot of television and so on and so forth. And then even in 93, I did a big thing with Berkowitz when he first spoke on television. And then I got involved in the Simpson case, the O.J. case, and then came back to Son of Sam after the Simpson case. So, in other words, I haven't had to live it 24 hours a day for all these years. I've certainly had extended periods of time when I've been away from it and doing other things. I found that you can't let something like this take you over, or you can just, get swallowed up by it.
Has this changed you in any way?
I think it's made me much more cynical, because I now have
Yeah.
virtually no trust in the powers that be. I see the lies that are told every day, and I see how cover-ups work, and I don't have a lot of respect for law enforcement in general. Lord knows there are a lot of great cops out there and a lot of great detectives, but there's a lot of real incompetence in law enforcement also. And once you get to the higher levels of it, where it becomes political, where police officials and all are playing games with City Hall and so on and so forth, and where it's the CYA, cover your whatever attitude takes over, I think there's a great disservice being done to the public in many, many jurisdictions throughout this country.
I'm curious, when you're talking about this kind of stuff, do you feel that a lot of this stuff is leading us somewhere, and that, the process, for example, was just one of those stepping stones to something much bigger or something much more sinister, or do you think that, this is just the way it plays out?
I don't know how much more sinister than one can get than the process is all by itself. What I don't know, and I don't know if I'll ever know, and frankly, I don't know if I want to know, is if some of these things we've talked about, what could be above them. Whether there's something above them or not, I don't know. One would suspect there is, only because, as I said before, how in God's name are they allowed to exist for so long?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, that's a very good question.
Is law enforcement that incompetent, or do they have friends in high places? Well, I know they have friends in high places, but do they have friends in places high enough to make sure that nobody bothers them? Are they is what Sanders speculated true? Could they perhaps be in a rogue intelligence operation gone awry at some point, and rather than expose that and all of the repercussions that would come from that people in high places look the other way? I just don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had to work from the bottom up on this, and I think we've gotten pretty high with it.
Yeah.
And I wish the FBI would get off its
posterior,
right, and go out and mount a real investigation into this.
Yeah.
Although they're probably too busy trying to figure out who killed John Benet Ramsey.
Do we see any evidence in our culture today? Do we see any evidence of this activity, like in murders that occur? Things that we hear in the news. Is there anything that you see there that is connected to this?
That I can't really say at this point because, there are people keeping an eye on what the process is doing. But they're, the 60s are over with, the 70s are over with. They don't go around with the black capes anymore.
Yeah.
They've abandoned the satanic
They're in suit and
stuff
ties.
entirely. They're on the internet. They're doing things very sophisticated.
Yeah. Okay, Maury, we're going to take another break. We'll be back in just a moment with that. Maury Terry is my guest, and we're talking about the Son of Sam case. Maury, where's all this going to go? I mean, are you hopeful that in a short time, are we just kind of like, kind of pointing to the wind with all of this? Do you think anything is ever going to come down and get resolved on this?
I would... In a sense, it has been resolved, Michael. I mean, we now know what the truth is. Obviously, I can't convene a grand jury. I don't have a badge, a gun, or subpoena power.
You ought to, really,
yeah,
because you've done a hell of a job with this.
Sometimes I wish I could. But, I feel that it's to a point where I've basically taken it almost as far as I can take it. It's been served up now on a silver platter, and the recent investigation by Yonkers, which lasted 2 years. Yonkers is a big city. It's the fourth largest city in New York State. We're not talking about some podunk police department here. We're talking about a police department that has over 500 people on it. So it was a big city investigation. They've come up with the same thing I've been saying for years, and what the Queens DA in New York back in the late 70s and early 80s came up with also. There was, in fact, a conspiracy in this case. So I think it should be federal. I think this was interstate. It absolutely was interstate conspiracy to commit murder. And there's an ongoing criminal enterprise here. And I believe it calls for federal intervention because only the feds have the jurisdiction, really, the budgets, etc., who can cast the net across the various states where this whole thing has been operating and continues to operate today. As I said earlier, with a couple of exceptions, the original core of process, and that's over a dozen, the leaders of this whole thing are still together in the same place.
How much do you think Berkowitz has withheld up to this point?
Not a lot.
So
really.
He's actually pretty much told it all.
Well, as far as he can go, considering the environment he's in. I mean, he has certainly provided enough leads where things were able to go out and be investigated and be corroborated.
Is there going to be enough?
And there have been other informants, other sources, other participants, or fringe people like Jesse Turner, who we talked about before,
right,
who have been able to provide names and so on and so forth. It's absolutely safe to say now that the identity of all the Son of Sam shooters is known. The identities of those who assisted at crime scenes is known. The identities of the people who ordered this thing, who set it up, are known. And we have a pretty good handle on the reaches into the upper levels that this thing had and how that was accomplished through processes' ability to reach out for people and provide them with kids and all and get them into the web and make them vulnerable because of their sexual perversions.
Jeez. Do you foresee another book for you?
I don't know. I don't know if I know The Ultimate Evil. I have reason to believe through conversations with publishers that The Ultimate Evil is probably going to be released again next summer. Whether or not there will be another book is hard to say. That depends on the publishing world. I mean, it might be at the stage now where publishers would say, well, only if there are indictments, So I just don't know. I mean, at some point I would like to do another book because I think the case calls for one.
Yeah.
Whether or not that will be so, I don't know, or whether I'll just do some more television on it, I just don't know.
Wow. Well, it's an incredible story, Maury, and I want to thank you for being on the program with us talking about this article in Gear Magazine. Fascinating stuff.
Thanks, Michael. My pleasure.
All right. We'll stay in touch. I'm sure if anything else develops, we can talk to you again.
Absolutely so.
Okay. Maury, thank you very much. That was Maury Terry. And again, he published a book in the late 80s called The Ultimate Evil. And as you just heard, that book may be re-released by the publisher. And if you're at all inclined to do so, you might want to get Gear Magazine and check out the article. It's very, very interesting. Gives you up-to-the-date up-to-date stuff if you were following that Son of Sam case like I was. It's very interesting.
In the late spring of 1976, disco fever was setting the night on fire in New York City. Just a little further north, a group of young men and women were lighting a different kind of fire. Arson was just one of their crimes. They were also holding satanic rituals in the woods, sacrificing animals to their sacred demons, and dealing drugs and weapons. Now, this outlaw band of devil worshippers were about to use some of those weapons to take the next deadly step.
I never thought that the day would come when we would start to kill people. I never knew even that one day was going to come when I would break the law.
But David Berkowitz was about to do just that. During a trip down south to visit his adoptive father, Berkowitz would make a swing through Houston, Texas. There, in June of '76, he had an old Army buddy buy him a Charter Arms .44 caliber Bulldog revolver that he would take back with him to New York.
44 caliber Bulldog, is that?
The weapon would become the signature on an infamous chapter in American criminal history.
Were there different guns involved?
Yeah, I think they were, yeah. Because other people had handled, I know, mine, and there was a number of all different kinds of weapons. As far as those 44 Bulldogs, they were, I think, maybe 2 or 3, if I can gather correctly, that were around.
Well, let's talk about that for a bit, just a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, there were a series of 8 attacks known as the Son of Sam killings.
Yeah.
Did you do all of them?
I was at all of them. I was at, more or less at all of them, scouting the areas and reporting back on likely targets and things, and I did not pull the trigger at every single one of them. And I believe the police do know that. I think that they were able to realize that after time, although it's not important, I mean, because I did do some of the crimes. I did take some lives, and I'm very sorry for that. And I look back and I said, my God, you know, how did this all come about? How did this all begin? And I just don't know anymore. I don't know.
David Berkowitz had just confirmed the thrust of my entire investigation, that he had not been the lone Son of Sam. I wanted more information, but I didn't know how far I could go with him. He'd soon lead me through the killings one by one and tell of his role in each of them. But there were some other questions I wanted to ask.
At these crime scenes, David, were there always extra people, accomplices on the scene, assisting the shooter in one way or another?
Yes.
What roles would those people play?
Sometimes to be prepared to drive away, others to take a gun if need be, or just to scout the area and so forth. And that was basically it, you know. And we, of course, everyone had played a role as far as the chanting and the praying. Everyone had a role in that, and understanding that, you know, this was going to be another sacrifice to our gods. Right. Bunch of scumbags that they were. Our gods, Lucifer and his crew. And we said, yeah, this is going to be another one for you, you know. And I said,
what the world knows as the Son of Sam shootings, where did that just happen, or did this, or were these, or did they just want more violence and they planned that they were going to do this?
Well, there was certain days that within a time frame that the greater sacrifices had been called for. You know, a fire is okay on a night in whatever, but sometimes there were different holidays and so forth.
You mean satanic holidays?
Yeah,
witchcraft holidays.
Right.
Would they try to do some of these incidents approximate to those holidays?
As close as would be possible, because so many circumstances were beyond our control.
Is that how they viewed these shootings, or at least most of these shootings, as like the ultimate sacrifice? Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah. It was a total waste. Made no sense. It made no sense. At the time, we couldn't see that. At the time, we didn't, you know. But you got to a point, and you got to be in it to understand. You have to be in it to understand, and most people would never understand. They say that's too far-fetched to even be real.
But it became horribly real.